Eleanor Hale climbed the east stair of Rowden Hall still wearing her wedding gloves, because no one had yet told her she was allowed to take them off. 3 days a wife, and the house had not once paused to explain its own rules to her, only to enforce them, the way a river does not explain itself to a stone it moves. The stair smelled of beeswax, and beneath that of something colder and older, stone that had not been properly warmed in a generation. Frost had come early that year, and it sat along the window-sills in a fur so fine it looked almost deliberate, an ornament rather than a season. The Dowager Duchess walked half a step ahead of her, skirts making no sound at all, which Eleanor had already come to understand was its own kind of speech. At the top of the stair the old woman stopped before a door with a brass plate gone green at the edges and said this would be her room, not a sitting room, not even a parlour. A schoolroom, disused these 20 years, the last governess gone before Eleanor was old enough to be taught anything at all. You were bred to chalk, my dear, and you may find you are more at home with it than with china. There was no cruelty raised in her voice, which was somehow worse than if there had been, because it meant the unkindness cost her nothing. Eleanor said thank you, your grace, because there was nothing else to be done with the sentence, and the door was opened, and the cold of the room came out to meet her like a hand extended in the dark. Dust stood in the light of the one high window, the way smoke stands in a chimney before it decides which way to go. There were 4 small desks, chairs scaled for children long since grown, a slate board gone the grey of old rain. She had grown up in a room almost exactly like it, on the other side of the village, where her father had kept 40 children more or less honest with sums for 30 years, and so the smell did not frighten her the way it was perhaps meant to. It welcomed her, in fact, the way an old coat welcomes a shoulder it once fit. She crossed to the cupboard beneath the window, because habit, more than curiosity, sent her there, and found inside it a stack of forgotten copybooks, a broken abacus, and beneath both of these, wrapped in a square of felt gone thin as a moth's wing, a hand slate framed in chipped elm, cracked once across its near corner, not broken through. She held it a moment without knowing why her chest had tightened around it. It was, she would have said if anyone had asked, only a slate. Nobody asked. The dowager had already gone. A woman came instead, some minutes later, broad through the shoulders and brisk in a way that suggested she had decided long ago which battles were worth her breath, carrying a tray with 1 cup, and a teapot dressed in a knitted cosy, the colour of a robin's chest. "This is Mrs. Tansey, your grace," she said of herself, setting the tray down on the least dusty desk. "And if you're wondering whether the room's always been this cold, it has. And if you're wondering whether anyone will come up here to check on you, they will not unless you ring. And the bell's broken, has been since before my time." She looked around the room with the particular satisfaction of a woman confirming an old grievance. They put the last governess up here too, wept for a week and asked to be sent home. Eleanor said she did not think she would be weeping, and Mrs. Tansey looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that measures rather than judges, and said, "Well, we'll see what spring makes of you then," and left the tea to go cold exactly as the house intended. Eleanor drank it anyway. She had been raised on the principle that a thing offered, however grudgingly, was still a thing offered, and her father had taught her never to waste what came free, chalk least of all. She thought of him then, the particular hush of his classroom at the end of a long afternoon, the way he would tap the board twice before a lesson as though waking it, and the words he said so often the children could recite them back at him in chorus, half in mockery and half in love. "Chalk rubs out," he used to say. "Ink keeps its word. She had not understood it as a girl. She understood it a little better now, sitting in a dead man's cold inheritance of a room, with a slate she could not explain wanting to keep, married 4 days to a man she had spoken perhaps 40 sentences to in her life, most of them at the altar. The marriage had happened with the speed of an accident, rather than the slowness of a courtship, arranged in a fortnight by people who had not troubled to ask her opinion of it, and she had gone along with it the way a person goes along with weather, because there had been no useful alternative, and because her father was 3 years dead, and there was no one left to ask what he would have wished. She set the slate on the nearest desk, facing outward, the crack toward the window, and told herself this was nothing, only tidiness. Below the window the elms stood bare and black against a sky the colour of an unwashed cup, and in their crowns a scatter of rooks sat hunched and silent, the way a room of strangers sits before anyone has found the courage to speak first. She did not yet know their names, nor the name of a single tenant on the estate, nor why the house had gone so quiet when the marriage was announced instead of loud, the way houses are supposed to go loud for a duke's wedding. She only knew the room was cold, and that some part of her, stubborn as her father had always said she was, had already begun deciding it would not stay that way. That evening, as she sat mending the hem her wedding gloves had frayed against the stair rail, she heard, very faint through the old glass, a sound that did not belong to wind or to rook, a small human sound, a child's voice pitched low, as though testing whether the walls of Rowden Hall would carry it to anyone who mattered. She went to the window. She saw nothing but the dark shapes of the elms, and beneath them the paler shape of someone standing very still, watching the one lit window in that whole cold wing of the house. The boy was gone by morning, but the print of a small boot remained in the frost beneath the window, and Eleanor stood looking at it for longer than the sight strictly warranted before she went down to breakfast, where she met, for the first time, as something other than a bridegroom recited over by a vicar. The Duke of Rowden. He came into the small breakfast parlour already dressed for the estate rather than for her, boots that had seen mud that morning, a coat with a torn button he had not troubled to have replaced, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw her the way a man stops when he has forgotten, briefly and honestly, that a fact of his life has changed. "Your Grace," he said, which struck her as a strange thing for a man to call his own wife, and she said it back to him, because there did not seem to be another word yet available to either of them. He was younger than the gossip in the village had prepared her for, and more tired than any of it had mentioned. They sat. A servant poured. For a while neither of them said anything at all, and the silence had the particular texture of two people counting the ways a conversation could go wrong before choosing, cautiously, one that might not. "I understand my mother has given you the old schoolroom," he said at last, and something moved behind his eyes when he said it, quick and gone, like a fish turning under still water. She wondered if it was pity. She decided, watching him more carefully than politeness strictly required, that it was not. "I like it well enough," she said. "It has good light in the morning, and no one troubles me there." He looked at her as though she had answered a question he had not asked aloud, and said that the room had been shut up a long while. 20 years, she said. He said 22, with a precision that surprised her, the kind of number a man keeps without meaning to, the way a coin stays in a pocket long after its use has passed. She asked him, because the morning seemed to require some bravery from someone, whether he had been taught there himself as a boy, before the governess and after, in whatever gap her father's arrangement with the estate had once filled, and watched him go very still over his coffee. For a little while, he said. Before I was sent away to school properly, it was not much of an answer, but she noted the way his hand had tightened on the cup, the way a man's hand tightens on a thing he does not want to set down too quickly, for fear of what his face might do in the meantime. She thought of the boy's boot print beneath her window, and of the slate with its old crack facing outward on the desk, and something in her. Some instinct, honed over years of watching 40 children lie about broken windows and torn primers, told her there was a thread here worth pulling, though she could not yet say toward what. Instead, she said only that she meant to open the room again, properly, to any tenant child whose family wished it, and watched his face do something more complicated than surprise. "You need not trouble yourself," he said. "There is no shortage of things for you to occupy your days with here." It was the closest thing to an order she had yet received from him, and she found she did not care for the shape of it, however gently it had been offered. "I was not asking your leave, your grace," she said, "only informing you of my plans, as I understand a wife is meant to do." He almost smiled. She watched him decide not to, the way a man decides not to spend a coin he may need later. "Inform away, then," he said, and rose, and at the door he paused with his hand on the frame, and for a moment she thought he would say the thing that had moved behind his eyes twice now unspoken. And then Mrs. Tansey came in with the post, and the moment closed over like water. He left for the home farm before she had finished her tea. She spent that morning sweeping the schoolroom herself, refusing the offer of a maid, because the work steadied her hands and gave her something to do with the restlessness the breakfast had left behind. By noon she had found, tucked behind the cupboard's lowest shelf, 3 more copybooks in a hand she recognized instantly as her own father's, dated further back than she would have expected, the ruled columns of sums and names running down each page in his careful schoolmaster's script. She did not read them closely that first day. She only noted, the way one notes a stone in a boot before it becomes a blister, that a 4th book, its spine cracked to match the years the others carried, seemed to be missing from the set entirely. Its absence, a gap on the shelf, shaped exactly like a book. She thought little enough of it then. She had not yet learned that in that house. The things left carefully absent said more than the things left carefully present. Toward evening the boy came back, bolder this time, and stood at the base of the elms until she opened the casement and asked, plainly, whether he meant to stand there all winter catching his death, or come in and be useful. He said his name was Sam Brindle, that his mother had told him not to bother her ladyship, and that he had come anyway, because he had heard from the dairymaid that the new Duchess kept a lit window past dark and a warm room behind it, and that this seemed, to a boy of 9 with 3 younger sisters, and a father 3 fields deep in another man's debt, worth the risk of a scolding. She let him in. She gave him bread, and let him warm his hands at the meagre fire Mrs. Tansey had grudgingly allowed her, and before he left she set the old cracked slate in front of him, and asked him to write his name, and watched him do it slowly, correctly, with more care than she had expected, and thought, watching the chalk catch in the crack and skip, that a room does not stay empty long once a single child has been let in out of the cold. The room did not stay a secret past the first fortnight, which was never Eleanor's intention, and entirely her fault regardless, since a lit window and an open door are not things that can be kept quiet in a village where every hearth shares its news the way it shares its salt. By the 2nd week of the new year there were 7 children on the benches some mornings, tenants' sons mostly, 2 farmers' daughters, whose mothers had walked them up the drive themselves to see with their own eyes that the Duchess meant what the dairymaid had reported, and Eleanor had begun keeping a proper register. Her father's old habit passed down into her hand, without her quite deciding to adopt it. The Dowager learned of it at a dinner, which was the worst possible way for her to learn of anything, because it meant she learned of it in front of witnesses, and a woman like Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Rowden, did not forgive being surprised in company. The table that evening was not large, but it was correctly assembled, in the sense that every person seated at it had been chosen for a reason, and Eleanor understood within the first course that one of those reasons was herself, laid out for inspection like a piece of plate whose provenance was still in question. Lady Cordelia Ashley sat across from her, lovely in the unhurried way of a woman who had never once had to hurry for anything, and beside Cordelia her father, Sir Aldous, a heavy, courteous man whose courtesy Eleanor noted was of the kind that costs the speaker nothing, and the listener everything, since it left no opening for refusal anywhere inside it. Mr. Vane sat near the Duke's right hand, which surprised her until she understood, from the ease with which he was addressed by every person at that table, including the Dowager, that a steward who has served a family faithfully for 20 years earns himself a seat closer to the salt than his birth alone would grant. He was, she thought, watching him across the candlelight, a genuinely pleasant man to look at, silver at the temples in a way that read as distinguished rather than aged, and his smile arrived promptly whenever the conversation called for one, which she would only later come to recognise as the single most telling thing about it. "I hear the old schoolroom has found a new use," Sir Aldous said over the fish, in the tone of a man remarking on weather. "Half the village up at the hall of a morning, or so my bailiff tells me." Eleanor said that 7 children was a good deal short of half the village, and that she was glad the bailiff found it worth his notice. "It is certainly novel," the Dowager said, in the voice she used for things she had decided, in advance, to disapprove of regardless of their merits, though I confess I wonder whether a duchess's time is best spent teaching tenant boys their letters, when there are households to be run and a name to be properly represented before the county. "My father ran a household of 40 children on less coal than this dining-room burns in an evening, Your Grace," Eleanor said, "and found a way to see that every one of them could read a lease before he signed it, which I am told has saved more than one family in this parish from ruin they did not understand they were agreeing to." She felt Julian's eyes on her from the head of the table, and did not look at him, because she suspected that if she did she would find something there she was not yet ready to name. Vane laughed, easily, a warm and generous sound, and said that Rowden had always been fortunate in its schoolmasters, that old Hale had been a good man, a careful man, missed sorely when he passed, God rest him. And there was nothing at all wrong with the sentiment, except that Eleanor, watching his hand as he said it, saw it tighten very slightly around the stem of his glass, the way a man's hand tightens when he is being careful about something he has said 100 times before, and still has not made entirely comfortable in his mouth. She filed the observation away, without knowing yet what drawer it belonged in. Cordelia, for her part, said almost nothing all evening, but toward the end of it, as the ladies withdrew, she fell into step beside Eleanor in the corridor and said, quietly enough that it did not carry, that she thought it a fine thing Eleanor was doing with the room, and that she hoped Eleanor would not let the Dowager's manner discourage her. Since Augusta disapproved of most things on principle, and warmed to almost none of them until she had first been proven wrong. It was said with no edge at all, which was, Eleanor thought, either the mark of a genuinely generous nature or a very well-practised one, and she could not yet tell which. Later, once the guests had gone, and the house had settled into its particular nighttime quiet, Julian found her in the corridor outside her own room, still in her dinner silk, and said, without preamble, that she need not have defended the schoolroom quite so publicly. "I did not ask you to fight my battles for me," she said, "before you did." "I was not aware we had established whose battle it was," he said, and there was something almost warm in it. An attempt at the kind of banter that requires two people comfortable enough to risk it, and she found herself, despite the dinner, despite the dowager, almost smiling back. "You did not marry me for my skill at dinner conversation, Your Grace," she said. "No," he agreed, and the warmth went out of his face as quickly as it had come, replaced by something more careful, more guarded. "I did not." There was a silence then that she recognized, from her father's classroom, as the particular silence of a person deciding whether to confess something and then deciding, at the last moment, against it. "Why did you marry me?" she asked plainly, because plain speech had always been the only currency she trusted, and he looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight, and said only that it was a longer conversation than the hour permitted, and that he was sorry, and that he did mean, truly, to have it with her before too much longer passed. It was not an answer. She had taught enough children to recognize a sentence built entirely to avoid one. "You settled an account," she said, quiet enough that it did not sound like an accusation so much as a fact laid gently on a table between them. "And you have not yet decided whether to tell me which account it was." He did not deny it. That, more than anything he might have said, told her she had struck close to something true. They struck their bargain 3 days later, in the cold light of a morning that had not yet decided whether to snow, and it happened the way most bargains happen in that house, quietly, over tea, with neither party quite naming aloud what was being traded. The dowager had summoned Eleanor to the small parlour she kept for herself, a room blessedly warmer than the schoolroom, and considerably more expensively appointed, and had come, with the directness of a woman who found subtlety a waste of good hours, straight to her point. The county would gather at Rowden for the harvest charity in the spring, as it did every year, she said, a gathering of some consequence, tenants and gentry both under one roof. And it fell to the Duchess, whoever she happened to be, to preside over it. "I do not ask you to give up your schoolroom," Augusta said, which Eleanor understood to mean that she very much wished her to, "but I do ask that you keep to the forms the county expects while you have it. No talk of accounts, of leases, of what a bailiff does or does not report honestly to his master. Leave the estate's business to the men whose business it is, and mind the charity, and the children, and your husband, in that order or whichever order suits you, and I will trouble you no further about the room." It was, Eleanor understood, an offer of peace dressed as a set of instructions, and she was tired enough and new enough to the house, and fond enough already of the children on her benches to take it. "I will mind the charity," she said, "and the children, and I will ask no questions of Mr. Vane that are not my business to ask." She did not say she would ask none of herself, and the dowager, satisfied with the letter of the promise, did not think to press further into its spirit. It was a bargain Eleanor would come, before very long, to regret, though not yet, not on that grey, unresolved morning, with snow still deciding its own mind outside the glass. That same afternoon, Julian found her again in the schoolroom, later than his habit, and sat, awkwardly, in one of the desks scaled for a child half his size, his knees nearly to his chin, and the sight of him there, folded up like a boy caught after hours, undid something in her that the dinner and the parlour both had left intact. He picked up the cracked slate from where it sat among the copybooks and turned it over in his hands, the way a man turns over a coin he is not sure he still has the right to spend. "I broke this," he said, at last, not looking at her. "I was 9 years old, and your father kept me an hour after the others for a sum I had copied wrong twice running, and I grew angry, the particular fury a boy has when he is more frightened than he understands, and I threw it, and it cracked against the sill, just there." She looked at the crack. She had known, somehow since the first afternoon, that the story attached to it was not a small one. "I remember," she said. "You could not," he said. "You would have been what? 6, 7, I remember my father telling the story after," she said, "not the day itself. He never told your name. He only ever said a boy in the schoolroom broke a slate, and a girl in the schoolroom took the blame for it, rather than see him caned. And he never could work out why, and it became, in our house, a kind of family joke, the mystery of the honest girl who lied. I was that girl," she said, and watched the colour go out of his face and then come back into it, high in the cheeks. The particular flush of a man discovering a debt he had not known he owed for 20 years. "Why?" he said, when he could speak again. "Why would you do that, for a boy you did not even know?" "I do not fully know," she said. "Honestly, I think I did not like to see anyone caned. I think, too, some part of me even then understood that a boy who threw a slate in anger was not truly angry at the sum." He set the slate down very carefully, corner to corner, the way a man sets down something he has only just understood the weight of, and said that he had thought of that hour more times across 20 years than he could easily account for, and had never once known the name of the person to thank for it, and that finding the slate again in this house, in this room, married now to the very girl, had felt to him, since the day she arrived, like a debt come suddenly and unexpectedly due. "That is why you married me," she said, not quite a question. "It is part of why," he said, and she heard, in the word part, the whole shape of the thing he was still withholding, and before she could press him on it there came a brisk knock and Vane's voice through the door, apologising for the interruption, but wondering whether his Grace might spare a quarter hour for the matter of the Northfield drainage before the light failed entirely, and Julian rose, and the moment closed the way a door closes on a room you have only just begun to see the corners of. He paused at the threshold, and said, low, that he would tell her the rest of it soon, that he owed her that much and more besides, and she believed him, mostly, the way one believes a man who has just proven himself capable of an old and private tenderness, and let him go to his drainage and his steward, and sat a long while after with the mended silence of the empty schoolroom, and the cracked slate and the growing. Unwelcome certainty that there was a great deal more buried in that house than one broken piece of elm. The discrepancy, when she found it, was so small she nearly missed it, which she would later think was rather the point of it, since a lie built to endure 20 years cannot afford to announce itself. She had begun, in the slow weeks of that cold spring, transcribing her father's old copybooks into a clean register for her own use, matching names of children, long grown against names of children now on her benches, fathers and sons across a generation, and it was in this dull, patient work, the kind of work that had always suited her better than conversation, that she noticed the Poor Scholars Fund. It was a small charity, endowed decades back by some Rowden ancestor to buy slates and primers and winter boots for tenant children too poor to furnish their own. Administered jointly, her father's old notes said, by the schoolmaster and the estate steward, and in her father's hand the sums allotted each quarter were recorded plainly, in his careful column, beside a second column. In a different hand entirely, recording what the estate steward's office claimed had actually been dispersed. For most years the two columns matched to the penny. For the last 3 years of her father's life, they did not, the second column always some pounds heavier than the first, as though more had been spent than her father himself had ever seen arrive. She sat a long while with the two mismatched numbers before her, the fire guttering low, and felt the particular chill that has nothing to do with weather. Mrs. Tansey found her there past midnight, the tea long cold again, and stood in the doorway a moment before she said, in the voice of a woman who has decided a thing needs saying plainly, or not at all, that she had wondered how long it would take. Eleanor asked her what she meant. "Your father was not a man to keep 2 sets of numbers by accident," Mrs. Tansey said. "He kept them because he did not trust the numbers he was being handed, and he was not a man to say so out loud until he was certain, and certain men in this house, your Grace, have a way of not living long enough to finish being certain." It was said without drama, the way Mrs. Tansey said most things, and it landed harder for the lack of it. "He died of a fever," Eleanor said, more to hear herself say it than because she doubted it. "He did," Mrs. Tansey agreed. "Fevers take tired men faster than rested ones, and your father spent the last winter of his life sleeping 4 hours a night over those very books. If the kitchen gossip of the time is to be trusted, and kitchen gossip in my long experience is trusted a good deal less than it deserves to be." She said no more than that, refusing, with the particular discipline of a woman who has survived 30 years in service, by knowing exactly where her usefulness ended, to name a name or point a finger, but she did say one thing more before she took the cold tray away. "A thing that is gone asks nothing further of you," she said. "It is only the buried things that keep asking." Eleanor sat with that a long time after the door had closed. She thought of the missing 4th copybook, its absence on the shelf shaped exactly like a book, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes at the bottom of a long cold night, that if her father had kept a private account of what he suspected, it would not be sitting in plain sight where any hand might find it. It would be somewhere only a schoolmaster would think to hide a thing, meant for another schoolmaster's eyes. She looked, for the first time since her arrival, not at the cupboard but at the floor beneath it, at a board slightly shorter than its neighbours, its nail-heads slightly brighter, as though set more recently than the boards on either side. She did not lift it that night. She told herself this was caution. It was, if she was honest with the part of herself that had learnt honesty from a man who kept 2 columns rather than 1. Also fear. The ordinary, unglamorous fear of a woman who suspects that once a board is lifted, it cannot be set back down unseen. She decided, before she slept, that she would ask someone who understood the estate's accounts better than she did. Someone who might explain the mismatch as an ordinary thing, a clerical slip, the kind of small honest error that afflicts every ledger kept by human hands, before she allowed herself to believe it was anything worse. She decided, in short, to ask Mr. Vane. She chose a morning when the light was good and her nerve was steadiest, and found him in the estate office off the stable yard, a room lined with ledgers bound in the same brown board, going back further than she could easily estimate, and he received her with the same warm, unhurried courtesy he had shown her at every meeting since her arrival, rising from his desk, drawing out a chair, asking after her health, and the schoolroom both in the same easy breath. She laid the 2 columns before him without preamble, because she had learned from her father that the direct question, asked plainly, catches more truth than the clever one asked sideways, and watched his face as he read them. He was, she had to admit even then, very good. There was no start, no widening of the eye, only a small thoughtful frown, the frown of a careful man confronting a puzzle rather than a guilty one confronting exposure. "Ah," he said, "old Hale's private reckoning." He kept his own tallies, alongside the offices, out of an excess of diligence, God rest him, and the two did not always agree, because he was counting differently than we were. He explained, at some length, and with the patience of a man laying out a lesson for a pupil he liked, that the fund's disbursements included not only slates and boots recorded at the point of purchase, but freight and cartage from the county town, expenses her father, working from the schoolroom, would have had no easy way to see or tally, and that the gap she had found was, he was quite certain, nothing more sinister than the honest fog that gathers around any account kept from two different rooms. It is the sort of thing, he said, that looks damning on paper and means nothing at all in practice, rather like two clocks in the same house never quite agreeing on the hour, and neither one a liar for it. It was, she thought, a genuinely reasonable answer, delivered by a genuinely reasonable man, and she might have believed it entirely had she not, in the middle of his explanation, glanced past his shoulder at the long shelf of ledgers behind him, and noticed among the uniform brown boards one volume set very slightly forward of its neighbours, as though it were consulted more often than the rest, its spine worn pale at exactly the years her father's private tally disagreed with the estate's public one. She said nothing of it. She thanked him for his patience, and said she was relieved to hear it was nothing, and rose to go, and at the door, because some instinct older than caution moved her tongue before her sense could stop it. She said that her father had always told his pupils that chalk rubs out, but ink keeps its word, and that she supposed the same must be true of ledgers. Something crossed his face then, quick as the fish turning under water she had seen once before in her husband's eyes, though colder, and he said, with a small smile that did not quite reach as far as it should have, "That ink fades a good deal faster than schoolmasters like to admit, given enough years and enough damp, and that she should not put too much faith in old paper." She left the office with her heart going harder than her face allowed it to show, and that night, with the house asleep and the fire down to its coals, she knelt in the cold schoolroom and lifted the loose board at last, and found beneath it, wrapped in oiled cloth against the damp, the missing fourth copybook, her father's private hand running down page after page, in columns far more detailed than the ones she had already seen. Dates and sums and names, and at the very back, in ink gone brown, but perfectly legible, a final entry, later than any other, that read only that he meant to bring the matter before the Duke himself, God willing, before Lady Day, and had asked for an audience already granted. Lady Day had come and gone 3 weeks before he died. She did not sleep that night, and by the grey hour before dawn she understood two things with equal certainty: that her father had been murdered by nothing so simple as a knife or a fever, but by the plain and patient weight of a truth he had carried alone too long, and that she could no longer keep the bargain she had made with the dowager to ask no questions, because the questions had already been asked and answered by a dead man's own hand. She brought the copybook to Julian in his study before the household was properly awake, and watched him read it standing, because he did not trust himself, she thought, to sit through it, and watched the colour leave his face by degrees, page by page, until he reached the final entry, and went very still, the particular stillness of a man hearing a door close somewhere far off in a house he thought he knew every room of. He asked for an audience already granted, she said. Did he ever have it? Julian did not answer at once. When he did, his voice had gone flat in a way she had not heard from him before, the flatness of a man reciting something he has rehearsed alone in the dark many times and never once said aloud. He wrote to me, he said. Your father. I was away at school. He wrote that he had found irregularities in the estate accounts touching the Poor Scholars Fund, and that he wished to lay them before my father directly rather than through the steward's office, and that he trusted the matter would be resolved quietly and without scandal to any party, because he did not believe, even then, that it was malice so much as carelessness grown into habit. I was 17. I did not understand the letter's weight. I gave it to my father's secretary to pass along, and I never learned whether the audience took place, because within the month my father was dead of his heart, quite suddenly, and your father some weeks after him, and the matter, so far as I ever knew, died with both of them. He looked at her then, and she saw in his face the particular anguish of a man confessing not a crime, but an omission, a silence kept, he would have said, out of grief and confusion rather than design, and yet a silence all the same. I kept the letter, he said. I have kept it 19 years in a drawer in this very room, telling myself I would look into the matter properly once I was master here, and had the standing to do it without scandal, and I told myself too, if I am honest with you, that when a schoolmaster's poor pretty daughter came suddenly available for marriage at a price my mother thought reasonable, I saw in it a way to bring her close to this house and its papers without raising any alarm in the one man who had reason to fear an alarm raised, and I told myself that was practical rather than unkind, and I see now, hearing myself say it aloud to you, that it was both. She stood very still, absorbing the shape of it, the marriage she had thought a cold transaction revealing itself now as something stranger, half a rescue and half a use, both true at once. The way most human motives turn out to be more than one thing, wearing a single coat. You used me, she said, quietly, to test a thing you were afraid to test yourself. I did, he said, without flinching from it, and I fell in love with you somewhere in the doing of it, which does not excuse the first part, and I understand if you cannot easily forgive it. Before she could answer, before she had even decided what shape her own anger or her own tenderness ought to take, the study door opened without a knock, and Vane stood in it, composed as ever, saying that he had heard voices and wondered whether his Grace required anything before the morning's business, his eyes moving, quick and unhurried both, from Julian's stricken face to the open copybook on the desk between them, and Eleanor watched something settle behind his pleasant expression, like a stone dropping through still water, and understood, too late by exactly one careless morning, that the worst possible man in that house now knew precisely what they knew. Vane came to her alone 2 days later, in the schoolroom itself, while the children were at their dinner, and the room stood empty but for herself, and the cracked slate, and the low grey light of a sky still deciding on rain. He was, as always, perfectly courteous, and he closed the door behind him with the soft, unhurried care of a man who intends the conversation to remain private for both their sakes. Your Grace, I will not waste either of our mornings pretending we do not understand one another. She said nothing, which she had learned, from 20 years of watching her father manage difficult parents, was often the fastest way to make a difficult man say more than he intended. He told her, in the reasonable, almost gentle tone of a man laying out unfortunate but unavoidable facts, that the estate's finances were a good deal more precarious than either she or her husband fully understood, that debts inherited from the old Duke's time had been managed, quietly and at some personal risk to Vane's own reputation, by arrangements he did not expect a schoolmaster's daughter to appreciate the delicacy of, and that any public airing of old discrepancies now, however technically accurate, would not restore a single penny to the Poor Scholars Fund, but would very likely cost the estate its credit with Sir Aldous Ashe, whose loan alone stood between Rowden Hall and a reckoning at Michaelmas that would see tenants turned off land their families had worked 3 generations. "I am not cruel," he said, and there was no anger in it at all, which she found more chilling than anger would have been. "I am arithmetical, which the young always mistake for cruelty. Your father was a fine man, and a careless one, who mistook rounding errors for theft because he had never kept books large enough to understand how such sums actually move. I would not see his memory dragged through a scandal that would help no one and ruin a great many, your husband and yourself most of all. What he proposed, delivered with the same warm reasonableness throughout, was simple. The copybook could be returned to its board and forgotten. A sum, modest but not ungenerous, could be settled quietly upon her, in recognition of the schoolroom's fine work, perhaps enough to see it properly heated through next winter and the one after. The matter would end there, tidily, and no one, least of all the tenants whose futures hung on Michaelmas, need ever know there had been a matter at all. It was, she recognised, the tidy dishonest ending the whole shape of this house had been quietly offering her since the day she arrived, and she found, hearing it laid out so reasonably, that she did not want it, not for the sum, not for the peace, not even for the tenants he invoked so carefully. Because a peace bought with her father's silence twice over was not peace at all, but the same debt come due a second time. "Chalk rubs out," she said, "and Mr. Vane, you have spent 20 years very carefully rubbing out a column of figures and hoping the ink beneath it had faded with it. It has not. My father wrote it down because he did not trust his own memory to hold it honestly against yours, and I find, now that I have read it in his hand, that I trust his memory a great deal more than I trust your arithmetic." Vane's smile did not leave his face, but something behind it went very still, the stillness of a man recalculating. "Then I am sorry for you," he said, quite gently, and left her there with the rain finally beginning against the high window and the cracked slate cold beneath her hand. Julian tried to send her away 3 days after that, and it was, she would think later, the single greatest misjudgment of an otherwise careful man, born not of coldness, but of the particular clumsy love that mistakes protection for the same thing as respect. He came to her in the evening, drawn and grey, with a day spent closeted with lawyers and with his mother, and told her that he had arranged for her to go to her aunt in the county town for a fortnight, perhaps longer, until the matter of the accounts could be settled properly, that Vane was a dangerous man to have as an open enemy inside one's own walls, and he would not have her exposed to whatever shape that danger might take, that he could not fight for the estate and guard her both at once, and needed her safely elsewhere while he tried. He meant it, she understood even as he said it, entirely for her sake, and it was exactly, precisely the wrong thing to say to a woman who had spent her whole life being managed, dismissed, and quietly relocated by people who loved her less carefully than they believed they did. "You are sending me to the schoolroom again," she said, only a larger one this time, with better carpets, and he did not understand her at first, and she found she did not have the patience left to explain it to him gently. "You have decided, again, what I am to be spared," she said, exactly as your mother decided it, exactly as the whole of this house decided it the day I arrived, and was handed a room no one wanted. And I find I am tired, your Grace, unspeakably tired, of being protected by people who never once thought to ask me what I wanted protecting from. He said her name, once, and reached for her, and she stepped back, not out of anger exactly, or not only anger, but out of the plain conviction that if she let him hold her now she would agree to whatever he asked next, simply for the comfort of being held. And she could not afford, not with her father's ledger still warm from her own reading, to want comfort more than she wanted truth. She left the room before he could find better words than the ones he had already spent, and spent that night in the cold schoolroom rather than her own bed, and understood, sitting alone with the rain still going against the glass and the rooks silent and hunched in the black elms, that this was the lowest hour the house had yet handed her, lower than the wedding, lower than the dowager's insult on the stair, because it was the first hour in which the person who had hurt her had not meant to. And that kind of wound, she found, was a good deal harder to nurse than the other kind. She did not cry. She had never been much of a crier, even as a girl, and her father had told her once, not unkindly, that some people carry water on the inside, and it does them no harm there provided they let it move. She sat with the slate in her lap instead, tracing the old crack with one finger, and thought of Sam Brindle writing his name for the first time in careful crooked letters, and of the second column of figures that did not match the first, and of a dead man who had trusted ink over memory. And by the time the window had gone from black to the flat grey that comes just before a winter dawn, she had decided, quite calmly, exactly what she meant to do about it, and that no one, this time, however lovingly, was going to send her anywhere before she had done it. The harvest charity fell 3 days before Michaelmas that year, and the county came to Rowden Hall in greater numbers than it had in a decade, drawn as much by curiosity about the new duchess as by the customary claret. And Eleanor used every hour of the gathering exactly as the dowager had once instructed her to, presiding over the charity, minding the children, keeping to the forms the county expected, right up until the moment the long room stood full, and the toasts had been drunk, and Sir Aldous Ashe, primed by Vane some days before for exactly this purpose, rose to make what he clearly believed would be a friendly, ceremonial announcement regarding the loan and the estate's happy future prospects. It was then, in the pause before he could finish it, that Eleanor rose instead, and asked, in a voice pitched to carry to the back of a room she had learned to fill the way her father once filled a schoolroom, of 40 unruly children, whether the county might indulge her 5 minutes more before the toasts concluded, since she had a document concerning the Poor Scholars' Fund that touched, she believed, on every family present, tenant and gentry both. The room went the particular quiet of an audience unsure whether it is about to be entertained or embarrassed. She read the ledger aloud, her father's careful hand and her own steady voice together, column against column, year against year, the estate's public figures beside her father's private ones, and she read too the final entry. The audience requested and never, so far as any living person could say, granted, and she watched, as she read, the faces of the room do the work she could not have done alone, watched tenants who had paid rents for 20 years begin to understand, in real time, where some part of those rents had quietly gone, watched Sir Aldous' easy expression curdle into something far less friendly as he understood what his own loan had very nearly been used to paper over. Vane rose before she had finished, smooth still, offering the same reasonable explanation he had given her in private, cartage and freight, 2 clocks disagreeing honestly on the hour, and it might even have carried the room, so practised was it. Had Julian not stepped forward then, and laid upon the table, beside her father's ledger, the estate's own current rent book, opened to the very ledger page whose spine she had noticed worn pale in Vane's office, and asked him, in front of the whole assembled county, to explain why the entries in his own hand for the current quarter already anticipated a shortfall in the very fund he had just sworn, moments before, had never shown one. It was a small thing, a single anticipated figure written before its time, the kind of mistake only a man too confident in his own long safety would ever have made, and Vane's composure broke on it at last. Not loudly, but visibly, a lunge of the hand toward the open rent book, as though he might yet close it or tear the page before the room had finished reading it, a movement so plainly guilty that no further word from anyone was needed to convict him of it. Cordelia Ashe, to her lasting credit, spoke into the silence that followed, saying clearly, so that her father and the whole room heard it, that she had known Mr. Vane's hand in her own family's accounts a little longer than most present, having helped her father with his correspondence these 2 years past, and that she would swear, if it came to swearing, that the pressure applied upon her father to press this match, or that upon the Duke, had come from Vane's counsel a good deal more often than from any wish of her own, and that she, for one, was heartily glad the Duke had married where his heart plainly lay, rather than where a steward's convenience had wished to steer him. It was, Eleanor thought, watching her, an act of real grace freely given, costing Cordelia a measure of pride in front of a room that had half expected her to marry Julian herself, and she did not forget it. The dowager, when at last she rose, did not defend Vane. Though he had served her 30 years, and she had trusted him longer than she had trusted almost anyone, and it cost her visibly, an old woman admitting before her own county that her judgment of character, the one vanity she had always privately relied upon, had failed her utterly in the single case that mattered most. I believed him because it was easier than doubting him, she said, plainly, into a room gone very still, to hear a dowager confess anything at all, and I see now that ease is a poor test of any man's honesty, and a poorer excuse for a mother who let her own son marry in haste, rather than tell him what she half suspected and could not prove. Vane left the room himself, before anyone thought to ask him to, with what dignity a man can carry out of a room that has just watched him unmasked, pausing only once at the door to say, to Eleanor directly, that she had played the hand a good deal better than he had credited a schoolmaster's daughter with playing it, which she chose, then and afterward, to receive as the closest thing to respect the man was capable of offering. The room, slowly, began to empty around them, tenants and gentry alike drifting into knots of astonished conversation, and Eleanor stood a long moment amid the wreck of the evening's careful ceremony, her father's ledger still open on the table, feeling, for the first time since the frost had first fringed the sills of that cold-assigned room, entirely and unmistakably at home. Julian found her afterward in the schoolroom of all places, though the hour was late and no child had sat there since noon, and he came in the way he had come that first grey morning, awkward, uncertain of his welcome, and stood just inside the door as though asking permission to cross the rest of the floor. "I am sorry," he said, "before anything else, for the fortnight I tried to send you away, and for the letter I kept 19 years and never told you of, and for marrying you half to use you before I ever let myself admit I loved you. And I will go on being sorry for all three as long as you require it of me, but I find I cannot go on standing in this doorway, so I would be glad to know whether I am permitted to come further in." She looked at him a long moment. The man who had once broken a slate rather than admit he was frightened, grown now into a man who could at least stand in a doorway and say plainly that he was sorry, which she judged, on the whole, real progress. "Before you come in," she said, "I will have my terms, and I do not intend to soften them for the asking." He said he would hear them. "The schoolroom stays open," she said, "to any child in this parish whose family wishes it, gentry and tenant alike, on the same benches, for as long as I live in this house, and the fund Mr. Vane spent 20 years quietly bleeding will be doubled from the estate's own purse, and placed beyond any one man's private keeping, in trust, with tenant governors to audit it themselves each quarter, because I find I no longer trust any arrangement that depends entirely on one man's goodness." And the third, he said, "And you will never again decide, on my behalf, what I am to be spared knowing, however loving your reason," she said. "If a thing is coming for me, I would rather meet it with my eyes open and my father's ledger in my hand than be sent off safely somewhere to be told of it afterward." He crossed the room then, all the way, and said that he accepted every term without argument, and that he had, in fact, one of his own to offer in return, which was that she never again doubt, whatever the cold arithmetic of how their marriage had first been arranged, that what had grown inside it since was entirely, uncomplicatedly true. They were married a second time, in a manner of speaking, that spring, not in law, which had never needed correcting, but in the fuller sense the county understood, a proper wedding breakfast held at last, with the whole parish invited, rather than merely the fashionable half of it, and Sam Brindle, scrubbed pink for the occasion, stood at the very front of the crowd with his 3 sisters, all of whom had joined the schoolroom benches by then. A year turned over, and then a season more, and by the following spring, the spring the whole county would afterward remember as the one the rooks came back loud and early to the elms outside the east windows, the old schoolroom of Rowden Hall had become, without any deliberate plan on Eleanor's part beyond simply keeping the door unlocked. The fullest room in the county, benches added twice over, waiting lists kept by families from 3 parishes distant, and the dowager herself, in her old age grown fonder of being right about her daughter-in-law than she had ever expected to be, took to bringing her own particular friends up the east stair to show them, with something close to pride, the room she had once handed over as an insult. The cracked slate hung by the door by then, mended along its old break with a thin band of brass Julian had commissioned himself and never told her the cost of, too fine now for chalk, kept instead as the first thing any new child saw on entering, and beneath it, at Eleanor's own insistence, a smaller slate for daily use, unbroken, waiting on its peg. On a bright morning in that fullest spring, with the elms outside loud again with nesting rooks, and the light falling clean and early through the high window exactly as it had the very first cold morning she had climbed those stairs still wearing her wedding gloves, Eleanor knelt beside the newest and smallest pupil the room had yet held, her own daughter, not yet 3. Chalk gripped fierce and clumsy in one small fist, and guided the first letter of her name across the slate the way her father had once guided hers, and did not look up when the door opened behind her, because she had long since learned the particular weight of that step in the frame, and knew, without turning, exactly whose it was, and that he had come, as he always did now, simply to watch the room be full. If this one kept you a little longer by the fire tonight than you meant to stay, then the cold outside can wait a while yet. Tell me in the comments which line stayed with you longest, whether it was the mended slate, or Cordelia's grace in that crowded room, or the moment Eleanor finally set her own terms down plain. because I read every one of them. And they are half of why these stories keep getting told. Stay close to Dr. *Channel _name Dickage and settle in, because there is always another tale waiting to be lit once this fire burns low. Sleep gently tonight, and be kind to whoever is waiting for you when you wake.